Hello, it's Colin again. Today is November 5th, 2020. We are still waiting for the results of the 2020 election, and I thought this was a good time to talk about something controversial. Not about politics, because no, that's not what this is about. Actually, about programming, and specifically about the assignment operator in R. So there is this general thing where we want to be able to set a variable to have some value or values. For example, we might want x to be 5. And the sort of programming term for that is assignment. We want to assign the value of 5 to the variable x. Now, in R, there are several ways to do that. I think there's 5 or 6, but there are two common ones. One of them, which is the one you probably have seen elsewhere, is to use this arrow symbol, which is I guess for you, it's this direction, the less than symbol and then the dash. So you would have x less than 5. And the other way would just be to use an equal sign, x equals 5. The short version of this video is that both of those work. You should use whichever one you prefer. The rest of the video is going to be diving into the subtle differences between them and a little bit of the background for why we use this arrow symbol. So the arrow symbol is the more common approach. If you look at, for example, the Google Style Guide, which is the instructions for Google employees on how to write scripts, they are required in R to use that arrow symbol for assignment. The history of that arrow is, I think, a lot of why people prefer it. So R is based on this programming language called S, and S was inspired by a programming language called APL. And APL was developed on a specific keyboard that had a single key that made the arrow symbol. When they wrote APL, they used that arrow for assignment because there was a single key for it and it was easy. In S, they continued with that tradition even though it was not designed with that specific keyboard in mind, and so users had to actually type the less than symbol and then the dash. And to be compatible with that, R also uses that for assignment. The obvious downside is that now we don't have a keyboard with a specific arrow key, and so you have to hit the less than and then the dash, which is, really 3 keystrokes because the less than is a shift key. If you're working in something like RStudio, there are hotkeys that allow you to make an arrow with only 2 key presses, but that's still more work than just hitting an equal sign. Now, they do behave very slightly differently in a specific context that I'll show you in a second. But the short version is that either one actually works, and a lot of this pressure to use the old one is not really relevant for us. If you are writing code that you want to also run in S, then yes, you should use the arrow key. But if you are a biologist writing code to work with your data, you are not writing it to run in S, so you don't need it to be backwards compatible. All right, so that's the gist of it. I'm going to jump into RStudio and show you sort of the specific cases where it might be a little bit different. But again, use whatever you want. Okay, so I opened up a new instance of RStudio. We can look and see that there's nothing in the environment. We can double check that using the ls function, which tells us the names of every object in the environment. Right now it's returning a character vector with 0 entries in it because there's nothing in the environment. All right, so our question is, how do we assign the value 5 to x? And like I said, historically, the way we would do that is with this arrow symbol, x arrow 5. And if I run this line of code, so Control Enter, it shows up in the console over here. We can see that if we look in our environment section, we have this variable x that has a value of 5. If we wanted to check that in the console, we can just type in x, and it will print out the value of x, which is 5. The other way that we could do this, so let's now set x equal to null, so we've essentially emptied it out. We can do exactly the same thing with x equals 5. And again, if we run it, we see that we have this x variable with a value of 5, and yes, x is 5. So both of these work. I have this very minor quibble where if we look at the line 3 with the arrow assignment, if we put a space between the less than sign and the minus sign, now R is going to interpret this as a test of, hey, is x less than -5? And right now x is +5, so it will give us the answer of false. I find it a little bit irritating when our code behaves differently because we have an errant space in the middle of something, but that's not really enough of a reason to avoid using the arrow symbol. I avoid it just because I don't like typing it out. But let's talk about the case where it is actually different. So you may have come across the concatenate function before, but it's a way of taking several items and turning them into a single vector. So let's make this vector of 1, 2, and 5. If I run this line of code, we see, yes, we have an object with 1, 2, and 5 in it. All right, so I'm going to write two things that look like they should be the same. We have a version of this where we say y equals 5. Now, when R is interpreting this line of code, it is saying, hey, we're supposed to concatenate three things, 1, 2, oh, and we're supposed to concatenate this third item, and we want to give it a name of y, and the value should be 5. And so if I run line 9, we get the same thing that we had before, 1, 2, and 5, and this y is up here to designate that it is a label. And if we look in the environment, we can see that there is no object called y, right? We just used y as a label for one part of that big vector. Now you might imagine that we would have the same behavior if we had an arrow here instead. This is where R behaves differently. So R interprets equal signs and arrow symbols differently if they're inside of a function call. I'm going to talk more about functions in a later video, so if pieces of this don't really make sense, that's fine. I just want to give you the context for how they are different. So if I run this line of code, R is instead saying, okay, we want to make a vector with 1, 2, and hold up. Okay, so we need to make a variable named y. We're going to put the value of 5 into it, and now the third item in this vector that we're making is y, which has a value of 5. So the consequence is that if we look at the vector that we've created, it no longer has that label. And if we look at our environment, we actually have y existing, and y is 5. So really what line 11 is doing is it's a shorter version of two separate lines of code. So we have a line of saying, create this variable y and set it equal to 5. And then we have another line that says concatenate 1, 2, and our new variable y. Whoops, y. These two lines of code, 13 and 14, and line 11 are functionally equivalent. I find that coding where you are creating variables inside of function calls, I find that to be very confusing. It is harder to read and harder to figure out what is happening. So I don't think it's a good habit to get into. But this is the one case where an equal sign and an arrow symbol are different. Because of this difference in behavior, you will often see equal signs when you're creating a data frame, and you won't see those arrow symbols. So for example, let me make a data frame called dat. Don't worry about it if this code looks unfamiliar to you, but the basic idea is that we're making a data frame, so kind of like a part of a spreadsheet, with a column labeled x and a column labeled y. And if I run this code, and I look at the dat object, you can see that it did exactly that. We have two columns, one labeled x, one labeled y. We absolutely would not want to be using arrows here. When R interprets this set of code, it is creating a new vector x and a new vector y, and then it is plugging them into that data frame. So if we look at our environment, we can see that x and y are now vectors. And if we look at our dat2 object, we don't have clear labels. All right, so that's everything I wanted to talk about. I think I'm mostly making a mountain out of a molehill here. The important part is use whichever one. If you see me using an equal sign, know that I'm not making a mistake, but if you want to use an arrow symbol instead, you are more than welcome to. So all the usual stuff, like and subscribe if you found this useful, share with a friend, particularly if you are in an argument with them over which assignment operator you should be using. I'm not actually sure which video will be next, because I'm not sure where I'll slot this in, but hopefully it'll be something useful and exciting up ahead. And that's about it. I'll talk to you soon.